According to a latest report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the global military expenditure rose to a record high last year. As per the report, the total global military expenditure for the year 2022 stands at $2.24 trillion. That's huge. This is a rise of 3.4% than what it stood at in 2021 in real terms. So the question is, what exactly is driving up the global military expenditure? To talk about this, we have with us Dr. Malcolm Davis, who is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us on Beyond, Dr. Malcolm.
Thank you.
Now, the numbers are in front of us, $2.24 trillion. That's huge. It looks like the world is arming because of the war in Ukraine. Or is it as simplistic as that, or are there more factors contributing to it?
Oh, there are certainly more factors than Ukraine. I think that you have this concept called security dilemmas, where one state takes actions that causes concern in another state. That state then undertakes a response, and that reinforces the other state's actions. So in terms of defence spending, it could be a multiplicity of factors driving it at a global level, but certainly the war in Ukraine, I think, has been hugely important in terms of reshaping perceptions of the international order, and in particular, making it clear that major power war can happen. And so therefore you are seeing states, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, worried about China, for example, responding to the challenge or the risk that there could be war emerging in that region as well.
Right. Just to add to that, as far as the global picture is concerned, the big spenders are US, China and Russia, like you mentioned. Now, Washington has clearly spent almost $877 billion, and this despite rising inflation in the country. What's your take on this?
Look, the US, I think, is recognising that it's moved from one strategic era, i.e. the war on terror, to a new strategic era dealing with major power threats in the form of China and Russia. So they're having to shift gears conceptually and organisationally. The types of forces that they're invested in for dealing with the likes of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are not necessarily the types of forces that they need to be able to respond to China and Russia in the risk of major power war. So they're having to now invest in an awful lot of capability to catch up to that threat and be in a position to be able to deter China and Russia and prevent war from happening. And I think that's why you're seeing a shift in capability because the nature of the threat has changed.
Right, Dr. Malcolm, we are looking at one of the biggest defense rise since the end of the Cold War. But is this the right thing people should be doing or spending on? We're in the 21st century, and there are also issues of cyber warfare, which has again gained momentum and attention because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then why spend so much money on military? Do you think that we are going backwards?
I don't think we're going backwards. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, no one would spend anything on military power, and all that money would be invested in things like dealing with climate change and social welfare and poverty and so forth. But we are dealing in the real world here, and there are security dilemmas, there are threats that we have to deal with, we can't ignore. You talk about cyber, that's one form of warfare. It's not the only form of warfare. People talk about war these days in terms of multi-domain operations that occur across 5 domains, of which cyber is only one of those domains. So I think that we are locked into this in terms of defence spending to defend, firstly, defend our national interests, but secondly, to deter threats, to prevent them from becoming acute. And I think that ultimately, until we can change the nature of the international system somehow, such that the use of force is no longer considered appropriate by all actors, we are going to have to deal with this facet of human nature and this aspect of international relations.
Right, Mr. Malcolm. Now, with the world ramping up its military expenditure, does it signal that how diplomacy is failing? Because we're clearly seeing a scenario where nations are ramping up the military because they think that diplomacy might not work.
Yeah, well, certainly diplomacy is an important tool of statecraft, and it continues to be undertaken across the globe. But sometimes diplomacy does fail. And I think that you can see that where Russia and Ukraine is concerned, where, for example, Russia is completely ignoring international diplomatic efforts to end the war. And you can see the potential risk of it happening in regards to China against Taiwan, for example. There's lots of other areas of conflict around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, and so forth, where diplomacy simply isn't even on the table. It's not on the agenda because they're too busy fighting. So diplomacy has a role alongside economic sanctions, trade, engagement, but also defence and deterrence. It's part of the nature of statecraft.
Right, it looks like that we are living in an increasingly insecure world, with the countries across the world ramping up their military spendings. My last question to you, Dr. Malcolm, do you think that the countries will be able to roll back on the defence spending?
Not for some time. I think that we are probably entering a more dangerous period now than what we were in the past, where major power conflict is becoming more risky and more likely. So I think the possibility of some sort of move into a more peaceful world order is just not on the horizon. What we have to do is focus on, firstly, deterrence to prevent authoritarian states such as China and Russia from using force in a way that challenges our direct interests. And secondly, defence, to be able to respond to threats when they do occur and defeat them quickly, so that the, if you want to call it, the opponents of freedom and democracy in the world are not successful. And that's ultimately has to be our goal. What we do not want to see in 100 years' time, in the year 2123, for example, is an authoritarian world order where democracy, liberal democracy, is on the ash heap of history and is but a memory. So what we have to do is stand firm. We have to deter, and we have to defend. And that does require military spending.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Malcolm, for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.